It was a quiet evening in the small, tightly knit town of Pinewood, where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the neatly lined streets and modest homes. One house, however, stood out, not because of its grandeur, but because of the man who lived there. Jordan Carter was a humble, reserved man who had recently moved into the neighborhood. To most, he seemed like an ordinary guy in his mid-30s, keeping to himself and working odd hours. He rarely spoke about his past, and the locals were content to let their assumptions fill in the blanks. Some thought he was a drifter looking for a fresh start. Others speculated he was hiding from something. But the truth about Jordan was far more extraordinary than anyone could imagine. Despite his quiet demeanor, Jordan's presence didn't sit well with everyone. Pinewood had a reputation for being a peaceful town, but its undercurrent of prejudice simmered beneath the surface. For some, Jordan's arrival was unwelcome, not because of anything he had done, but because of the color of his skin. One group, in particular, couldn't hide their disdain. Led by a man named Rick Grayson, a local troublemaker with a history of petty crime and a deep-seated grudge against anyone who didn't look like him. This gang of misfits thrived on intimidation and fear. To them, Jordan was an easy target, a quiet outsider who wouldn't fight back. Or so they thought. It started with little things. A shattered window here, trash dumped on the lawn there. Jordan didn't react, brushing off the incidents as nuisances rather than confrontations. He'd fixed his window without complaint, cleaned up the mess without a word, and went about his day. But his silence only emboldened the gang. They mistook his calm for weakness, failing to notice the flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. A storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. One fateful night, the gang decided to escalate their harassment. Rick, fueled by liquid courage and an inflated sense of power, rallied his crew with a sinister plan. They would teach Jordan a lesson he wouldn't forget. Torches were lit, hammers were gathered, and under the cover of darkness, they descended upon his property. Jordan, inside his modest home, sat at his kitchen table, staring at an old photograph. It was a picture of him and his former Navy SEAL team, all grinning and clad in tactical gear. Memories of missions that had pushed him to his limits flooded his mind. Nights spent navigating hostile territory, rescuing hostages, and surviving against impossible odds. The life he had left behind was one of discipline and danger, a life he had buried deep when he returned to civilian living. But as the sound of breaking glass shattered the silence, Jordan's instincts kicked in. He didn't need to look out the window to know what was happening. Years of training had sharpened his senses, and he could feel the hostility in the air. For the first time since he arrived in Pinewood, he allowed himself to feel something other than peace. A smirk crossed his face, not of amusement, but of readiness. The gang, oblivious to the man they were dealing with, stormed the property, smashing windows, spray-painting hateful messages, and setting small fires on the lawn. Rick laughed loudly, his voice carrying through the night. Let's see how tough he is now. But inside, Jordan was calm. His pulse was steady, his breathing even. He moved silently through the house, assessing the situation with the precision of someone who had been in far worse circumstances. This wasn't the chaos of a war zone, but to the gang outside, it might as well have been. As the mob grew bolder, one of them stepped too close to the house, peering through a broken window. It was the last mistake he would make that night. In a flash, the door swung open, and out stepped Jordan, his figure silhouetted against the flames licking at the edges of his yard. His expression was calm, but his eyes were cold, calculating. Gentlemen, he said, his voice low and steady, you've had your fun. Now it's my turn. For a moment, the gang froze, caught off guard by his presence. But Rick quickly recovered, sneering as he approached Jordan. What are you going to do, huh? Call the cops. They won't get here in time. Jordan didn't respond. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate, controlled. The gang began to realize that something wasn't right. This wasn't the reaction they had expected. There was no fear, no pleading, just a man who looked at them as though they were nothing more than an inconvenience. Rick laughed nervously, gesturing to his crew to advance. "Get him," he barked. But as they moved toward Jordan, the tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. What happened next would become the stuff of legend in Pinewood, and it was only the beginning. The night seemed to hold its breath as the gang closed in on Jordan, their confidence wavering in the face of his unnerving calm. Rick, standing a few feet behind his crew, tried to mask his unease with bravado. "You think you're some kind of tough guy," he jeered, but there was a crack in his voice that betrayed his fear. Jordan didn't answer. His silence was louder than any threat he could have spoken. He stood still, watching every move they made, his posture relaxed but ready. It was the stance of someone who had seen far worse than a group of troublemakers with too much time on their hands. The first of them lunged forward, a lanky man with more bark than bite. Jordan shifted slightly, his movements smooth and efficient, and within seconds the man was on the ground, clutching his wrist in pain. He hadn't even seen Jordan move. The rest of the gang hesitated, their earlier bravado fading. They exchanged nervous glances, silently questioning whether this was a fight they wanted to pick. But Rick wasn't ready to back down. "What are you waiting for?" he yelled. "There's one of him and 5 of you." He stepped forward, trying to rally his crew, but his steps faltered when Jordan's eyes locked onto his. They were sharp, piercing, and completely unafraid. Rick felt a chill run down his spine, but he quickly shoved it aside, refusing to show weakness. Jordan, still silent, took another step forward. He wasn't angry, he was focused. Each move he made was calculated, as if he were playing a game of chess, and was already 5 steps ahead. "You don't want to do this," he said finally, his voice steady and firm. There was no arrogance in his tone, just a quiet certainty that made the gang uneasy. "Shut up!" Rick snapped, his voice rising in pitch. He gestured wildly to the others. "Get in already." This time, 2 of them charged at once, hoping to overwhelm Jordan with their numbers. But Jordan moved like water, fluid and unpredictable. He sidestepped one, his hand shooting out to disarm the other with a precision that spoke of years of training. The sound of a weapon hitting the ground echoed in the still night, and the man stumbled back, clutching his arm. The remaining 2 hesitated, their earlier confidence now replaced with visible fear. They had come here expecting an easy target, someone they could intimidate without consequences. But Jordan wasn't just defending himself, he was sending a message, and it was clear they were out of their depth. Rick, sensing that he was losing control of the situation, clenched his fists. He couldn't afford to back down now. His reputation depended on it. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" he snarled. "Some big shot tough guy." Jordan finally looked directly at Rick, his gaze unwavering. "I think you've made a mistake," he said simply. There was no malice in his words, but they carried weight, as though he were stating an undeniable truth. Rick's frustration boiled over, and he pulled a metal pipe from behind his back, brandishing it like a weapon. "You think I'm scared of you?" he shouted, though the tremor in his hand said otherwise. Jordan's expression didn't change. He stood his ground, his calm demeanor only fueling Rick's anger. The others, meanwhile, started to back away, clearly no longer interested in whatever lesson Rick had planned to teach. They had seen enough to know that Jordan wasn't someone to be underestimated. "You're alone now," Jordan said quietly, nodding toward Rick's retreating crew. "Walk away while you still can." Rick hesitated, his grip on the pipe tightening. He glanced back at his gang, who were now standing at a safe distance, their faces pale. He was outnumbered, outmatched, and deep down he knew it. But pride was a dangerous thing, and Rick wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. As the tension hung heavy in the air, a low rumble of thunder rolled in the distance. The smell of rain filled the night, and a sudden gust of wind sent the flames in Jordan's yard flickering. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Rick took a shaky step forward, raising the pipe as if to strike. But before he could move any closer, Jordan's voice cut through the night, sharp and commanding. "Stop." A single word froze Rick in his tracks. It wasn't a plea or a threat. It was an order, spoken with the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. Rick's bravado faltered, and for the first time he looked at Jordan not as a target, but as a man who would destroy him without breaking a sweat. "You don't know who I am," Jordan said, his voice low but firm. "You don't know what I've been through, but I'll leave you one chance to walk away. Take it." Rick opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The pipe slipped from his hands, clattering to the ground, and he took a shaky step back. His crew watched in stunned silence as he turned and stumbled away, muttering curses under his breath. One by one, the others followed, their bravado replaced with shame and fear. Jordan stood alone in the yard, the flames casting long shadows across his face. He watched them disappear into the night, his expression unreadable. Then, with a deep breath, he turned and walked back inside his house, closing the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. The yard was a mess, the windows shattered, and the air still heavy with the smell of smoke. But Jordan didn't seem to notice. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and sat down at the table, his mind already turning to what would come next. Because Jordan knew this wasn't over. People like Rick didn't just back down and walk away. They would be back, and next time they wouldn't come unprepared. But what they didn't know was that Jordan wasn't unprepared either. Far from it. As the rain began to fall, pattering softly against the roof, Jordan reached for the photograph on the table. His fingers traced the faces of the men he had once called brothers, the ones who had been with him through the worst of times. He had left that life behind, vowing never to return. But now, as he stared at the picture, he realized that some things couldn't be buried forever. Outside, the storm rolled in, lightning flashing across the sky. It was a fitting backdrop for the storm that was brewing within Jordan. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to go back to the man he had once been. But if they pushed him, if they forced his hand, they would see a side of him they couldn't possibly comprehend. For now, though, he waited, calm, patient, and ready for whatever came next. The next morning, Pinewood buzzed with rumors. Word spread fast in the small town, especially about what had happened at Jordan Carter's house. Whispers floated through the diner, the grocery store, and the barber shop. Some painted Jordan as a hero who had stood his ground against troublemakers. Others saw him as a man with something to hide, someone whose strength came from a dangerous past. No one knew the full truth, but speculation grew with every retelling. Rick Grayson, nursing a bruised ego and a swollen wrist, didn't take long to regroup. He sat in his usual spot at the back of McConnell's garage, a grimy, dimly lit space where he and his crew often gathered. His pride hurt worse than his injuries, and his anger simmered just beneath the surface. The others sat in awkward silence, glancing at one another but avoiding Rick's gaze. They didn't want to admit it out loud, but they had been scared. Whatever they thought of Jordan before last night, it was clear now that he was no ordinary man. "I'm not letting this go," Rick finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was low but full of venom. "He made fools of us." One of the men, a wiry guy named Dunny, hesitated before speaking. "Maybe we should let it go, Rick. That guy is not like anyone we've messed with before." Rick's glare silenced him. "He's just a man," Rick spat. "He's not untouchable. Nobody is," but even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the memory of Jordan's calm, the way he had taken them apart without breaking a sweat. It was humiliating. While Rick plotted his revenge, Jordan went about his day as if nothing had happened. He patched up his broken windows, cleared the scorched grass from his lawn, and waved politely to his neighbors. But beneath its calm exterior, he was on high alert. He knew Rick wouldn't back down, and he knew the next encounter would be worse. Jordan's neighbor, Mrs. Harper, stopped by with a plate of cookies. A kind-hearted woman in her 70s, she had lived in Pinewood her whole life and had seen her fair share of good and bad people. "I heard what happened last night," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "You all right, Jordan?" He smiled gently and took the plate from her hands. "I'm fine, Mrs. Harper. Thank you for these. She peered at him closely, as if trying to read his thoughts. You've got a calm about you that I don't quite understand. Most people would be rattled after something like that. Jordan chuckled softly. Let's just say I've dealt with worse. Her curiosity was evident, but she didn't press. Well, if you need anything, you let me know. And be careful. Rick Grayson's not the kind to let things go easy. I will, Jordan assured her. But as she walked away, he couldn't help but think about how little she, and everyone else, knew about who he really was. That night, Rick and his gang met again, this time the shadowed clearing by the old mill. Rick had been busy all day making calls, reaching out to old connections from his welder days. By the time he arrived, he had a new air of confidence, bolstered by the promise of reinforcements. A tall, muscular man named Kyle, one of Rick's old acquaintances, leaned against a truck, a smirk playing on his lips. So this is the guy who embarrassed you? Kyle asked, his tone mocking. Rick's jaw tightened. He won't do it again. Kyle shrugged. We'll see about that. But if you're paying me to take care of this guy, I want to know what we're dealing with. What's his story? Rick scowled. Nobody knows. He just showed up a couple of months ago, quiet as a mouse. People say he's ex-military or something. Kyle raised an eyebrow. Ex-military, huh? Might explain why you couldn't handle him. He laughed, but there was a sharp edge to his voice. Don't worry, I'll take care of it. Meanwhile, Jordan sat in his dimly lit living room. A map spread out on the coffee table in front of him. It was an old habit, something he had done countless times during his Navy SEAL days, studying the terrain, anticipating threats, planning for every possible outcome. His instincts told him the gang wouldn't give up, and his gut rarely led him astray. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. Memories of his past crept in unbidden. Missions in hostile territories, long nights spent in enemy territory, the weight of responsibility for his team's lives. It had been years since he left that life behind, but the skills he had honed during those years were still sharp. And now, for the first time since leaving the military, he felt the pull of those instincts again. As the hours ticked by, the tension in Pinewood grew. Rick's gang wasn't the only one watching Jordan. A young reporter named Lisa Hayes had caught wind of the story and was intrigued by the mystery surrounding the new man in town. She had been working on a series about small-town dynamics and the hidden conflicts that often bubbled beneath the surface. To her, Jordan was a puzzle waiting to be solved. Lisa parked her car a few houses down from Jordan's and watched as he moved around his yard, fixing the damage from the previous night. She couldn't help but notice the way he carried himself, confident, purposeful, like someone who had seen and done things that most people couldn't imagine. She decided to approach him the next day, hoping he'd share his story. Back at the old mill, Rick's gang was gearing up for their next move. Kyle, now the de facto leader of the operation, outlined his plan. We'll hit him hard and fast. No warnings, no second chances. If he thinks he's untouchable, we'll prove him wrong. The gang murmured their agreement, though some of them still felt uneasy. Donnie, in particular, couldn't shake the memory of Jordan's eyes, calm, focused, and utterly unafraid. Are we sure about this? He asked hesitantly. What if he's, I don't know, more dangerous than we think? Kyle shot him a cold look. Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance to prove it. As the group dispersed, Rick lingered behind, staring into the darkness. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a mistake, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. Whatever happened next, he was in too deep to turn back. In his quiet house, Jordan looked out the window at the darkened street. He could feel the storm coming, not the one in the sky, but the one that was brewing in the hearts of those who sought to challenge him. And he knew, deep down, that the time for quiet restraint was running out. The air in Pinewood was thick with tension as the days passed. People avoided asking too many questions about Jordan, but their curiosity was obvious. Some whispered that he had a dark past, while others speculated he was simply a man who didn't tolerate injustice. Whatever the truth was, the uneasy calm that had settled over the town felt like the quiet before a storm. Jordan kept to himself, maintaining his usual routine, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was coming. His instincts were sharp, honed by years of training, and every fiber of his being told him to stay vigilant. At night, he'd sit by the window, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of movement. He knew Rick wouldn't let things go. Men like him didn't back down. They regrouped, came back harder, and tried to reclaim what little power they thought they had. Across town, Lisa Hayes was piecing together her own puzzle. She had spent hours digging through records, trying to find anything about Jordan's past. But there was nothing, no history in Pinewood, no public records that stood out. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere. The mystery only deepened her curiosity. She decided to approach him directly, a risky move, but one she felt was necessary to uncover the truth. When she arrived at his house the next afternoon, Jordan was in his front yard, hammering the last piece of wood onto a new window frame. He didn't seem surprised to see her, as though he had been expecting someone to show up eventually. "You're Jordan Carter, right?" Lisa asked, her tone friendly but cautious. "That's right," he replied, without looking up from his work. "I'm Lisa Hayes. I'm a journalist. I've been hearing a lot about what happened the other night." Jordan set his hammer down and turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, in his eyes. "Is that so?" Lisa nodded, choosing her words carefully. "People are curious about you. You've kept to yourself since you moved here, but it's clear you're not just some ordinary guy. I was hoping you might tell me a little about yourself." Jordan studied her for a moment, as if weighing whether to trust her. Finally, he spoke. "I'm just a man trying to live a quiet life. That's all there is to know." Lisa wasn't convinced, but she could tell he wasn't going to open up easily. "Well, if you ever change your mind, I'd love to hear your story," she said, handing him her card. "And if you need help with anything, let me know." Jordan took the card but didn't respond. As she walked away, she felt a mix of frustration and intrigue. There was something about him, something he wasn't saying, and she was determined to find out what it was. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rick and his gang gathered once again. This time, they were armed with more than just bravado. Kyle had brought along reinforcements, men who didn't live in Pinewood but had reputations that preceded them. These were not the small-town troublemakers Jordan had faced before. They were men who thrive on chaos, who saw violence as a solution rather than a last resort. Rick paced back and forth, his nerves masked by a forced confidence. "We do this tonight," he said. "We end it." Kyle smirked. "Relax, Brayson. You're acting like this guy's some kind of boogeyman. He's just one man. We've got numbers, and we've got the upper hand." Rick didn't respond. He didn't want to admit it, but he wasn't as sure as Kyle. Something about Jordan unsettled him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something they didn't fully understand. As the gang made their way toward Jordan's house under the cover of darkness, the town itself seemed to hold its breath. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the rustle of leaves and the occasional bark of a distant dog. The closer they got, the heavier the air felt, as though the universe itself was warning them to turn back. Inside his house, Jordan was ready. He had spent the day preparing, not just physically but mentally. This wasn't a fight he had wanted, but it was one he knew was coming. He had no intention of running, no intention of backing down. When the first sounds of footsteps reached his ears, Jordan's heart rate remained steady. He moved through his home with practiced ease, checking the exits, making sure everything was exactly as he had planned. Outside, the gang spread out, their movements deliberate and cautious. Kyle took the lead, signaling the others to surround the house. From his vantage point, Jordan watched them through a narrow gap in the curtains. He counted 12 men, all armed, their faces set with determination. They thought they had the upper hand. They thought they were walking into a situation they could control. They were wrong. The first clash came suddenly. One of the men tried to pry open a window, only to trigger a carefully placed trap that sent him sprawling backward with a yelp. The noise startled the others, and for a moment, Chaos erupted as they tried to figure out what had happened. Jordan stepped out onto the porch, his silhouette backlit by the dim light from inside. "You should have stayed home," he said, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable authority. Kyle stepped forward, his smirk faltering slightly. Big words for a man who's outnumbered. Jordan tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched. The tension reached its breaking point. Kyle gave the signal, and the gang surged forward, their movements disorganized but fueled by adrenaline. Jordan didn't hesitate. He moved like a shadow, his actions precise and efficient. Years of training had taught him how to handle situations like this, how to anticipate his enemy's next move before they even made it. From a distance, Lisa watched in shock, having followed the gang out of curiosity. She had no idea what she was witnessing, but it was clear that Jordan was no ordinary man. The way he fought, the way he seemed to predict every attack. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. As the chaos unfolded, the gang began to realize the truth. They had underestimated Jordan. He wasn't just a man defending his home. He was a force of nature, a storm they had foolishly walked into. But even as they faltered, the night was far from over. The real fight was only beginning. The chaos outside Jordan's home reached a fever pitch. The gang, disoriented and bruised, regrouped in the yard, their confidence now replaced with uncertainty. Jordan stood on the porch, his calm demeanor unchanged, though his sharp eyes tracked every movement. He wasn't tired. Far from it. This was the kind of situation he had been trained for, the kind that turned fear into a weapon. But just as he began to calculate his next move, a noise from the street caught his attention, the low rumble of approaching vehicles. The headlights pierced through the darkness, revealing 3 large black SUVs pulling up to the edge of the property. The engines idled for a moment before shutting off, and the doors opened almost in unison. Out stepped a group of men dressed in dark tactical gear, their movements precise and deliberate. They weren't local, and they weren't part of Rick's gang. These were professionals, the kind of men who didn't show up without a purpose. Kyle froze, his earlier bravado evaporating. "Who the hell are they?" he muttered under his breath. Even Rick, who had been consumed by his vendetta, felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. This wasn't part of the plan. Jordan's gaze hardened as he took in the scene. These men weren't here by coincidence, and their presence changed everything. He recognized their stance, their formation, and even the faint glint of specialized equipment strapped to their belts. This wasn't a random escalation. Someone had brought them in, and it didn't take long for Jordan to connect the dots. Rick might not have known what he was dealing with, but someone else did, and they had gone to great lengths to even the odds. The leader of the new group stepped forward, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. He looked directly at Jordan, his expression unreadable. "Jordan Carter," he said, his voice steady but cold. "We've been looking for you." The air seemed to grow heavier as the words hung between them. Jordan didn't flinch, though his mind raced. These men knew who he was, not the quiet man living in Pinewood, but the soldier he used to be. He had spent years erasing his tracks, building life where no one could find him. But now it seemed his past had caught up to him. "You've got the wrong guy," Jordan replied evenly, though he knew it was a futile denial. The man smirked, a faint hint of mockery in his eyes. "Do we? Because I'd say your performance tonight suggests otherwise." Kyle, still frozen in place, finally found his voice. "Wait a second. What's going on? Who are you people?" The leader didn't bother to answer. Instead, he signaled to his team, who began to fan out, their movements efficient and intimidating. Rick and his gang instinctively backed away, realizing that whatever was happening now was far beyond their understanding. Jordan stepped down from the porch, his body tense, but his expression calm. "If you're here for me, leave them out of it," he said, motioning toward the gang. "They don't know what they stepped into." The leader raised an eyebrow. "Generous of you, but that's not how this works." Lisa, still hidden behind a nearby tree, watched in stunned silence. She had followed the gang out of curiosity, but now she was witnessing something far more complex and dangerous. Her instincts as a journalist screamed at her to document this, but her sense of self-preservation told her to stay still and hope she wasn't noticed. Jordan knew the situation was spiraling out of control. He had dealt with men like this before. Mercenaries, bounty hunters, the kind who operated in the shadows. They were after him for a reason, and he could only guess who had sent them. But he also knew that letting them dictate the terms would be a mistake. "You've got 10 seconds to explain what you want," Jordan said, his voice carrying an edge of authority. "After that, we settle this my way." The leader chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Still as confident as ever, I see. That's why they sent us, Carter. To remind you that no matter how far you run, you can't hide forever." The words struck a nerve, though Jordan didn't show it. His past, the secrets he had buried, the missions that had defined his life. All of it was supposed to be behind him. Yet here it was, dragging him back into a world he had fought to escape. Before Jordan could respond, one of the mercenaries raised a hand to his earpiece, his expression suddenly alert. "We've got company," he said, his voice clipped. The leader frowned, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of company?" "Local law enforcement," the mercenary replied. "Looks like someone tipped them off." Lisa's heart pounded as she realized what he meant. She had called the sheriff earlier, thinking it might prevent the gang from doing anything reckless. But now she wasn't sure if she had made things better or worse. The sound of sirens grew louder, their wailing echoing through the night. The mercenaries exchanged glances, their disciplined facade cracking slightly. They hadn't planned for this, and it was clear they didn't want the added complication of dealing with the authorities. Jordan took advantage of the momentary distraction. "You've got a choice," he said, his voice low but firm. "You can leave now and avoid a bigger mess, or you can stay and see how this plays out." The leader hesitated, his gaze flickering between Jordan and the approaching lights of the police cars. He wasn't afraid of the law, but the situation was spiraling out of his control. And if there was one thing men like him hated, it was losing control. As the first police car pulled up, its lights flashing, the mercenaries began to retreat into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they had arrived. The leader lingered for a moment, his expression dark. "This isn't over, Carter," he said, before turning and melting into the night. Jordan watched them go, his body still taut with tension. The police stepped out of their vehicles, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Rick and his gang stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The sheriff, a gruff man in his 50s, approached Jordan, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Care to explain what's going on here?" he asked. Jordan didn't answer immediately. His mind was already racing, trying to piece together what had just happened and what it meant for the future. One thing was clear: this wasn't over. Whatever had been set in motion tonight was only the beginning. The sheriff's gaze swept over the scattered remnants of the confrontation. The broken window traps, the bruised and shaken gang members, and Jordan standing amidst it all, calm but unyielding. It was clear that something larger had transpired here, something that went far beyond a local dispute. Rick avoided the sheriff's eyes, his once blustering confidence reduced to nervous silence. Kyle muttered something under his breath, but it was incoherent, his earlier arrogance crushed. "I'll ask again," the sheriff said, his tone stern. "What's going on here?" Jordan took a step forward, his voice steady. "It's over. These kids got caught up in something they didn't understand, but they'll stay out of trouble now. Isn't that right?" He directed the question at Rick, who nodded quickly, eager to end the scrutiny. The sheriff narrowed his eyes but didn't push further. He could sense there was more to the story, but Jordan's calm authority had a way of diffusing confrontation. "Fine. But if I catch any of you causing trouble again, you'll wish you'd stayed home." "Understood." His warning was met with a chorus of nods from the gang. It began to slink away under the sheriff's watchful eye. As the police turned their attention to securing the area, Lisa stepped out of her hiding spot, her heart pounding. She approached Jordan cautiously, still trying to process everything she had seen. "Jordan," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Who were those men? And why did they know you?" Jordan's expression softened. There was a guarded look in his eyes. They're part of my past, he admitted. A past I've been trying to leave behind. Lisa hesitated. You mean your time in the military? Jordan nodded but didn't elaborate. There are things I've done, things I'm not proud of. People who think they still have a claim on me. Tonight wasn't about Rick or his gang. It was about Lisa's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of what she'd witnessed. So what happens now? Are they coming back? Jordan's jaw tightened. Probably, but I'll be ready. Just as the tension seemed to subside, a commotion erupted near the edge of the property. One of the officers shouted, and all heads turned as a shadowy figure darted from the tree line. It was one of the mercenaries left behind in the hasty retreat. He stumbled, clutching a small device in his hand. The sheriff raised his weapon, barking orders for the man to stop, but the figure kept moving, his desperation palpable. Jordan acted without hesitation, sprinting toward the man. Before anyone could react, he tackled him to the ground, the device slipping from the man's grasp and landing a few feet away. The sheriff rushed over, securing the mercenary as Jordan picked up the device. It was a small, unassuming object, but Jordan recognized it immediately, a GPS tracker. Lisa stepped closer, her curiosity outweighing her fear. What is it? She asked. Jordan's expression darkened. It's how they found me. Someone's been tracking me, probably for weeks. The sheriff looked between Jordan and the mercenary, his suspicion growing. Care to explain why someone would be tracking you? Jordan met his gaze, his voice firm. Because I'm not just a veteran. I was part of an elite unit, one that doesn't officially exist. And there are people out there who don't like loose ends. The sheriff's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't press further. He could tell there was a larger story, one he wasn't equipped to handle. Well, whatever this is, it's above my pay grade, but I'd suggest you figure it out fast before more of them come looking. Jordan nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. The people who had sent the mercenaries wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, and now they had drawn Pinewood into their web. He couldn't let innocent people pay the price for his past. As the night wore on, the mercenary was taken into custody, and the police began to disperse. Lisa stayed behind, her journalistic instincts screaming at her to dig deeper. But she also felt a growing respect for Jordan's need for privacy. If you ever want to tell your story, she said softly, I'll be here. Jordan offered a faint smile. Thanks, but some stories are better left untold. The next morning, Pinewood seemed eerily quiet, as if the events of the night before had been nothing more than a bad dream. But for Jordan, the weight of what had happened lingered. He stood on his porch, the GPS tracker in his hand. With a sharp motion, he crushed it beneath his boot, severing the connection to those who had been hunting him. But as he looked out over the horizon, a faint glimmer of light caught his eye. It was another device, barely visible, tucked under the roof of his house. A second tracker. His breath caught, and for the first time in years, he felt a cold dread settle over him. Whoever was after him wasn't done. Not by a long shot. There had been steps ahead all along. As he removed the second tracker and stared at it, Lisa appeared at the gate, her expression concerned. Everything okay? She asked. Jordan turned to her, his face unreadable. No, he admitted, but it will be. He dropped the second tracker to the ground, crushing it like the first. I'll make sure of it. Lisa didn't press for details, but she could see the resolve in his eyes. Whatever battle Jordan was about to face, she knew he wouldn't back down. And as the morning sun rose higher, bathing Pinewood in light, the faint hum of another vehicle could be heard in the distance.